The floor is yours.
Okay, that's a lot. Hi. Hi, everyone. Because I feel it's strange just to talk to you. We have a whole audience here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So how I got into creative activism, it was a little bit by chance. I was born in apartheid South Africa. There's a lot going on here with all this technology. I was born in apartheid South Africa, and my parents were resisting the apartheid movement, were artists that were working in creative industries, but were using their art for activism. So my mother's an art historian, my father's a theater maker, and they were both political activists. So from a young age, I realized that actually activism can look like different things. It can look like marching in the streets, but it can also look like theater. It can also sound like music. Like activism can be so many different things. So that when I grew up, it was in my blood to become an activist. I looked around and we were only pursuing one or two or three types of activism, types of tactics. And also, I saw that creativity and artistry was such a wonderful entry point into communicating with people. So often, it's so much easier to talk to someone about the music that they love or what the latest series that they're watching, and then use that as an entry point for my sneaky political agenda around women's rights, around sex worker rights. Talking about the fun in activism, I think this is something we often don't do enough. We work on incredibly serious issues, depressing issues, and sometimes we can't see the fun in it. But I would argue that fun is a really important part of the work that we do. It gives us energy, it gives other people energy, and it really provides a really good entry point to get other people to join us, to join our campaigns. What I really want to talk to you today is about some of the work that I've done, but more about the work that I work with other social movements and organizations on, and that is how to insert more creativity into the activism that they do, why it's important, and some of the lessons that I've learned. So think about this as creative activism for beginners, to answer the last question that was given. I'm just going to look at some of the different campaigns I've worked on and what are some of the learnings that we can apply to our own campaigns to make them more creative, more accessible. But I'm quickly going to start here with who am I? I'm not an expert. This is no, not an expert. This is work that I love to do. This is work that I love to do with different organizations. I'm growing in it every day. I work with other incredible organizations like the Center for Artistic Activism who've been doing this for decades. It's not something you become an expert in. It's something that you are always learning through talking with people, through traveling, through looking at the different types of activism that people are doing around the world. The first question that I really like to ask, and I think I might ask this to our moderator because you're sitting there with a mic, I want to know what made you care about human rights? We all have this moment. We all care for human rights in some ways. Otherwise, we wouldn't be giving up our Saturday afternoon to be here. You could be doing so many more enjoyable things right now than sitting in this room listening to me. But there's a reason that you care about human rights. But there's also a time that you didn't care about human rights. When you were running around as a child, I'm not sure whether if someone asked you when you were 3 years old what you wanted to be when you grew up, you said, well, you know, I want to be a human rights lawyer, or I want to advocate for refugee rights in South Sudan. Like, I'm fairly certain something happened to you or around you or with your parents or your family, or you saw something that made you decide, actually, I'm going to care. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to join a protest. I'm going to join an organization. I'm going to read up about a particular organization that does human rights-based work. I know for me it was when I was a young kid. I would go and visit my grandmother, and there was always tension visiting my grandmother because there would always be fights between my parents and my grandmother because I have an older brother. And my grandmother would always say, Ishta, come to the kitchen. Bashka, you can stay in the lounge. And this was always a fight because my parents were like, no, both my children are treated equally. This is not how we work at home. Both children need to learn how to cook. We don't do this thing at home where Ishta cooks and Bashka doesn't. And this was always a point of tension. And that was my first light bulb moment as a child where I was like, oh, something's not quite right with the world. And that was what started making me care about women's rights in a very small and subtle way that then grew more and more active as I grew up. So I'm asking, what made you care? Why are you here?
I come from a family of journalists, so I think when I was old enough to understand that, my father especially, the hardships that he had and in his profession, but also his first boss, for example, in Turkey, the editor-in-chief of Milliyet newspaper was assassinated when he first started as a reporter. So when I was old enough to understand that there were a lot of slain journalists in Turkey and also who are imprisoned because of the news that they were reporting, and they still are imprisoned to this day. So for me, it started with advocating for the right to information and freedom of speech, especially for journalists. That's how it got me.
Okay. So for me, I'm going to stand. This is weird. So for me, this is a really important question. And I've asked this question to hundreds of people working in human rights around the world. And they've all given me very similar answers. So really meaningful, visceral experiences, whether it's a case of them being refugees or something happening to their mother being a survivor of domestic violence, or witnessing the detention of a friend. Everyone gives me these stories about what made them care. And why I think this is really the fundamental question of creative activism is because what are we trying to do in our activism? We're trying to make other people care, right? Like, we're trying to make other people more empathetic, more kind. We're trying to get other people to get up and do something. So my question to you is, when I've asked these questions to hundreds of people, and think about the answer to your question. If I asked that question to you, what would your answer have been? And what I found is that very few people, of the thousands of people I've asked, said, I signed a petition. And suddenly I was motivated. I read a pamphlet. No one has said to me, I came to a conference and I watched a panel and then I decided to dedicate my entire life to human rights. But these are the tactics that we do in our activism. I'm not saying these aren't important. These are really, really important, that we use these tactics and strategies for social change. But what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is really fundamentally make people care. And if these tactics didn't make us change our behavior, how do we expect it to change the behavior of others? If it didn't work for us, why would it work on someone else? So my question is, how do we create those feelings that move people to care in our activism? And one of my answers would be using creative tactics. And so what is creative activism? So it's looking at the creative imagination and really trying to apply it tactically, strategically, and organizationally to make activism more effective. The second point is really important. Everyone has a creative life they can bring to this activism. I don't want to hear this, I can't draw, I can't sing, I'm not creative. That is nonsense. Everyone here has some way that they express themselves creatively. Whether you throw an amazing dinner party, whether you love fashion, you make an amazing playlist. I have a friend that does the most creative budgeting on spreadsheets I have ever seen in my entire life. We all have some sort of creative outlet that we use. My question is, how do we take that creative outlet and apply it to our activism? What's really important that it's about long-term change, not a once-off tactic. So creative activism is not around, I don't know, doing a flash mob and getting 5 million likes on Facebook. It's about thinking creatively about how we approach our advocacy. And this applies not only to direct action, but for example, strategic impact litigation. Some of the most creative people I know are human rights lawyers, when they think about how to be creative about how they interpret the law and how they advocate for human rights through law. So it's about making sure that it's really part of a long-term strategy for change, not necessarily just a once-off tactic. And the final kind of important thing about creative activism is the truth will not set you free. This idea that if people just had the information, if they just had the evidence, they're going to make the right decision. And I think all of us know that this is not true. We can provide so much correct, evidence-based information to policymakers. That does not mean that they are going to make the right decision. That is not going to mean they change their behavior. So the idea is the truth is really, really important, but often it needs some help. And this is where creativity can really help the truth along a little bit. So this is something that for me has been really fundamental in thinking about how we approach creative activism. So it's a term that was invented by the Center for Artistic Activism that I work with. So effect, we know effectiveness. I identify as an activist. Activists are very effective human beings. We get things done. Like I know in South Africa, where I'm based, if you wanted me to organize a 500-person march in 24 hours in front of Parliament, I could do it like that. Like, we get shit done as activists. Artists are very affective people in the sense that they know how to move people. That's their bread and butter. You look at a painting, you listen to a piece of music. You don't have to say a lot, but you feel something. And so where the magic happens in creative activism is when you combine effect and affect, and you get affect. And this is when you combine the effectiveness of activism with the affectiveness of artistry, and you get something that can move towards social change, but also create that feeling in people, that feeling that you had when you decided, I need to stand up and do something. And so just a few lessons and examples from different campaigns that are happening all over the world. And just to preface this with, this is not an exhaustive list. I know I'm going to go through a couple of examples, and someone's going to say, but I have this organization. This is not exhaustive. These are just a few examples to highlight some key lessons. There's an amazing website run by the Center for Artistic Activism called Actipedia. It's like a Wikipedia, but for creative activists. And please contribute to it. It's creative activists all around the world putting up all their creative activities on the internet. But the first one I want to talk about is in Bogota. So in Colombia, this new mayor comes in. This is in the 70s and 80s. And there's a huge issue with traffic fatalities. So a lot of people are dying, pedestrians and motor drivers, car drivers. And they're doing this because they're not obeying the rules of the road. And people are driving badly, and no one is paying attention to the rules of the road. So the mayor came in, and we're like, okay, what could I do about this? So a lot of people's approach would be regulation. We need regulation, we need speed bumps, we need fines, we need education. There's a lot of things we can do to make sure people drive safer, pedestrians are better about crossing the road and obeying the rules of the road. He took a different tactic. He was like, you know what? People in Colombia hate to be mocked. Like, mocking is just the worst thing. You can find people, it won't make them change their behavior, but mocking might work. And there was a lot of corruption in the police. And so he fired all the police officers and hired them back as mimes. And so the job of these mimes, they were to mock people when they didn't obey the rules of the road. And you might think this is a really strange approach to solving traffic issues in Bogota, but you know what? It worked. It reduced traffic fatalities by over 40% in a very short amount of time. And so this is an example of how using surprise can be a wonderful way of really catching people off guard. Would this work in South Africa? Probably not. Would this work in your country? Maybe, maybe not. It's not about whether it will work in your country or not, because context matters, but it's about thinking, what would surprise people? Suddenly they see a mime, they stop, they ask themselves a bunch of questions. They question themselves in a way that, having gotten a fine, would never have made them change their behavior. Another example, the Me Too movement. So in China, we know online, really high restrictive policies in censorship in the media and the internet. And so the Me Too movement happened, and activists couldn't talk about it and couldn't publicize it because the government was really clamping down the Me Too hashtag. So feminist activists in China said, okay, let's think about this. How can we start the conversation and join this international growing conversation of Me Too? And they thought, me means rice in Chinese. Tu means bunny in Chinese. What if we call it the Rice Bunny Movement? Because the Chinese government can't ban rice on the internet, and they can't ban bunnies either. So in this way, the Chinese activists were able to use the Me Too movement and the Me Too hashtag by being creative about it, by thinking a little bit differently, but most importantly, by knowing their terrain and using it to their advantage. Like, they knew what would be able to get through kind of the Chinese government's algorithm and what wouldn't. So when you think about your activism and using creativity in your activism, you are the best people to do it. Someone on the outside can't come in and say, this is what you should do. You know your terrain the best, and how do you use that to your advantage? How do you use your humor in your community? Because humor might be different. Something that's funny in one community might be not funny in another. So the really important thing is cultural terrain is our terrain as activists. So how do we really get to know it, and how do we use it to our advantage? This campaign, incredible campaign happening in Argentina around the campaign for legal, safe, and free abortions. What this campaign really taught me about creativity was the use of signs, symbols, and spectacles. This green bandana became the sign and the symbol for the movement. With something as simple as a green bandana, you can show so much. It can be instilled with so much meaning. So when we're thinking of our campaigns, how are we thinking of using signs and symbols and spectacles in our campaign? Because now my colleague tells a story of, she was on the bus and she had a green bandana tied to her backpack. And this woman came running up to her and she was like, can I just hang with you? There's a guy that's harassing me. Can we just have a conversation, pretend like you know me? For me, that was amazing, because just having that green bandana said so much about who she is, what she believes, what her meanings are. She was a safe space for this woman just by having a green bandana. So when we think about our campaigns, how are we thinking about signs, symbols, and spectacles? Because that green bandana does more advertising, does more recruitment for me than any kind of pamphlet that I could get at a store. Like, how are we thinking about these signs, symbols, and spectacles? Come on, there we go. This is one of my favorite examples. It's with a group we're working with on corruption in North Macedonia. And an artist came in and was like, okay, I'm here to help you with your campaigns, what you care about. And they were like, corruption. Corruption is what we care about. So he was like, okay, corruption. What epitomizes corruption? What is like the visual of corruption? And for them, it was potholes. It was potholes that never, ever, ever got fixed. So they decided to do an interesting intervention. They held a fishing competition in one of the biggest potholes. They had a fishing competition, and in there you'll see a live fish, and they hung out, and people ask what you're doing. They're like, no, it's a fishing competition. It's going to be the annual fishing competition in North Macedonia, and we're trying to catch fish. And then journalists started showing up, and then the conversation started. And we're like, well, actually, there's these potholes because of corruption, and because of corruption, they're not going to get fixed. And we've complained, and we've written, and we've done all the things in our local municipality, and we can't fix these potholes. They got so much media coverage that those potholes were fixed in weeks. And so for me, this is an incredible example of sometimes, you know, simple works. There we go. Sometimes simple works. There's an example of school children doing something very similar using little rubber duckies, because in their country, ducks represent corruption, and all they did was float little rubber duckies in these potholes, and they were fixed within a week. So when we're thinking about creative activism, it doesn't necessarily have to be some really expensive, like big epic campaign. It can sometimes be just having a fishing competition in a pothole, and that could work. Talking about funny and being seriously funny. So this was a campaign run in Russia, and it was around corruption. And so and specifically around election corruption. And there was no way that activists could protest safely. So they decided to have a doll protest. And so all around the country, they had little dolls, and they were having signs about police corruption. And it was really funny. And I know a lot of people are looking at this going, but what kind of change could this have done? Like, surely, it's like little dolls holding some signs, went viral on social media, so what? The government took this protest so seriously, they tried to legislate against these meetings. They call these nano meetings. So and to be taken that seriously, to try and be legislated against, means that this was a threat. And this was a threat to the Russian government, but at the same time, managed to keep the participants safe. So really thinking about when you're in growing restrictive environments, when you're worried about safety, if you think about it creatively, maybe you can come at it from another angle. The same thing is, this is a very depressing situation, but they used humor. And humor was part of the reason why it was shared so widely with people, because humor is also such an amazing entry point to connect with people. So for me, this was a great example of how we can be seriously funny. Often people are like, no, but serious issues. But we really can approach it from a creative way, and a way that actually works to enhance safety for people who are in really, really restrictive environments. Speaking of restrictive environments, this war on smog, so this was in China. So we know the Chinese air quality is really, really bad. And a bunch of activists really wanted to protest this, but protest is illegal. And so a bunch of young people got together to say, how can we show people that this is a problem, that this is something we care about? And so they had this war on smog. And what is really smart about this was that War on Smog was the name of the campaign the government was running. So as far as the government was concerned, this could be like a supportive celebration of the government's war on smog. And they went about doing exactly what they do on weekends. They got married, they did ballet, but they did all of this with gas masks. What I find really interesting about this intervention was that they knew it was a protest. Everyone knew it was a protest. People looking at this knew it was a protest. The police knew it was a protest, but they couldn't do anything about it because it didn't look like a protest. It didn't look like the image that most people think about when they think of protests. So really thinking about activism in disguise. Like, how can we use our creativity to disguise our activism? Because the message was loud and clear, but they got away with it in a highly restrictive space because it didn't look like what activism is supposed to look like. This, for me, is an example of, quite often, I do this myself, is that as an activist, I often poo-poo pop culture. And I say, why must I care about what the Kardashians are doing? And I realize that actually, with creative activism, it's really important to know what's going on, what pop culture, what is bringing people together already. Pop culture is pop culture because it's popular. And so what are the elements of pop culture that we can think of that we can bring into our activism? And so this is an intervention and campaign called Conflict Kitchen. And basically, they want people to know about countries that America is at war at. And yes, they could have written a fact sheet and they could stand at shopping centers and give people the information about the countries that America's at war at and try and garner some form of empathy. They decided to go at it from a different point of view, where they were like, where do people organically gather? What do all people have in common? They eat. Everyone eats. And so how can we make eating part of our activism? And so they set up pop-up kitchens. And so every couple of months, there'll be a pop-up kitchen, and the theme of the food will be a country that America is at war with. And on the menus, on the food, on the receipt, will give the person more information. And I can guarantee you they reach more people, create more empathy with people through their food and through their information given about the people of that country through their food than they probably would have if they decided to hold a panel or give a fact sheet. So this, for me, is a really good example about using pop culture. And how can we think of pop culture in our activism? How can we use some of the elements where, think about where people already gather. What are people liking? What are people doing? And how do we use that in our activism? This is still online. If all of you have a chance, please go play this video game. It's a free video game online. And it's activists in Italy really wanting to draw attention to McDonald's and the harm that McDonald's is doing. But again, they've done all the things. They've written the white papers, they've done the interviews, and people are not just, they're not feeling that damage. They're reading about all the destruction in the Amazon and the hormones and the bad environmental treatment of, the bad employee treatment, but it doesn't move people to stop eating McDonald's. So they created this game. And you go online and you play it for free, and you basically have to run a McDonald's empire. And I'll give you a little cheat sheet. I tried the first time to play it, I tried to run it incredibly ethically. So you see, you have to run your grazing, you have to run your abattoir, you have to run your shop, you have to run your corporate headquarters, and I really tried to be a good person. Everyone had enough grazing space. I didn't give my cows any hormones. I paid my employees fairly. I hired enough employees. I didn't kind of do any corruption in the corporate headquarters, and I lost. And I tried it again, and I lost, and I keep on losing. And I was like, okay, maybe if I just overgraze the land a little bit, then I'll win. Okay, I lasted longer, and then I died. Okay, maybe if I graze the land a lot, and maybe if I bribe the indigenous leaders to take their land. Okay, I'm winning, I'm doing a little bit better. Okay, maybe if I just give my cow some hormones, that will make, okay, you know what I should do? I'm gonna only hire one person and not pay them anything and make them work overtime all the time, and then I'm gonna put ads in Disney and product placement. And so what you found is the more and more you became corrupt, the more and more you became damaging to the environment, the better you did. And for me, this was an incredible experience of what it feels like to be doing such evil things all together. Because I know if I read the connections between all of this in a research paper, I wouldn't have gotten that feeling. I'd have read in the paper going, oh, I see that they're bribing indigenous leaders and this results, and there's a nice diagram and a table. But there was something about playing this game for 20 minutes that got me to deeply understand the interrelationship and the complexity of this issue. And so for me it was, how do we demonstrate reality? We often forget that the term demonstration comes from demonstrate. How are we showing people the reality of what we're dealing with? I live in Cape Town in South Africa, and I live right around the corner from our parliament. And there are protests outside Parliament like every 3 days. And this one time I was driving past Parliament and I hooted because I was going to hoot because that's what you do, like show solidarity and you hoot. And I was just about to hoot and then I realized I actually have no idea what these people are protesting. There's a group of them, there's some placards, it looks like what a protest looks like, but this could very easily be a white supremacy protest. Don't want to hoot for that. So for me, that was an immediate problem. How am I driving past and you're not showing me what you're protesting so I can be for or against it? So how are we thinking about demonstrating reality so when people join us, they get that feeling of what it means, what it feels like to run a McDonald's? This is also a pretty simple intervention by students in Cologne, and they wanted to protest around climate change. And for me, this is a visceral, like this makes me feel something. It makes me feel a sense of urgency. In one picture, we know what they're saying. And for me, this was so powerful because something like climate change is notoriously hard to do advocacy around because a lot of the change is slow and you can't see it. And so how do you create a sense of urgency in people on an issue that they can't see right in front of them? It's not like police brutality, which you can film and see. It's long-term impact. And so this was, for me, a very clever demonstration, because it demonstrated something that was invisible, and they made it visible. So how do you take things that are generally invisible? So for example, my work around domestic violence. Domestic violence is something that happens in the home. It happens often behind closed doors. So when you go out there in the world, like, how do you show people that this is important and they need to care and they need to do something? So when we're thinking about our issues and being creative about our approaches, are we thinking about how do we make the invisible visible? What are the different strategies we can use? I promise I'm nearly done with all my examples. But these are just some of the ones that really inspire me, but also taught me a lot in how I can apply some of those learnings into my own campaigning. This is an interesting example. It's actually done by an artist called Candy Chang. And this was right after Hurricane Katrina. And they were rebuilding New Orleans. And people were looking at how they were planning on rebuilding New Orleans, and they were doing a really bad job about it. And so Candy Chang printed out these stickers, $20, and went and slapped them on places all around New Orleans. And so if I would ask, me being a South African activist, if I had to ask my fellow activist, how would you go about community participation? How would you go about finding out what the community wants? Immediately, community dialogues. We love community dialogues. We love surveys. And these are all really important tools. This is an example of how to get community participation through a different way, through a very, very cheap way. And so people filled it in. I wish this was community garden. I wish this was Brad Pitt's house, a home, repaired, a bike rack, livable. This is a really, really interesting example of what it looks like to empower people, what it looks like to give people an opportunity to participate in a process. And she gathered all this up, and it was used for real-life policy change. So I think that's something that's also really important about all these examples. They weren't just for fun. They weren't just, oh, let's have a good time, let's try something different, let's hire some mimes, let's make some stickers. All these really made very tangible differences in the movements and the sectors that they were working in. And so I think this is my last one, possibly. It's my last one because it's my favorite one, and it confuses people a lot why I put it in there, but I put it in there for a particular reason. It's called 24-Hour Museum by a Chilean artist called Alfredo Yar. And so he wasn't that famous at the time, but he was famous enough to get invited to places to make art. And so he got invited to Skogul, Sweden. And Skogul, Sweden makes paper. That's what they do, they make paper. And he gets there, and the first thing he does when he goes anywhere, he says, "Take me to your museum or gallery." And the people of Skogul said, "We don't have one." Okay, that's weird. Okay, fine. That's going to be my gift to you, and that's going to be my art. I'm going to build you a museum. And so he did. He built them a museum out of paper because that's what they have and that's what they do. And they got local artists, but also local children to exhibit work. They got a Oompa band, because that's what you do in Sweden. Everyone had an awesome time. The mayor came, they advertised, they had speakers. It was a wonderful, wonderful affair. And they kept on seeing that the name of the museum was 24-Hour Museum. And so they asked themselves, "Oh, why? Why 24 hours? He says, "Well, I'm going to burn it down in 24 hours. And they were like, "No, you can't do that. You can't do that. No, you're not going to do that." So they mobilized, they went to the mayor, and they said, "He's going to burn this museum down. Like this beautiful thing that he's created, he's going to burn it down." And the mayor said, "Well, that's the deal. That was the contract. Like, it's part of the art. Like, he can do that." And so the people said, "Okay, no, you know what we're going to do? We're going to mobilize. We're going to go to the fire department. This is a fire hazard. The fire department will never let this happen." They go to the fire department and they say, "He is going to burn this down. This crazy man is coming and burning down this museum that he built, and we really like it. Fire hazard, you can't." The police's response were, "We're the ones that are going to burn it down." And so they burnt it down. And so you may ask me, what does this teach us about creative activism? What this teaches us is what happened after this. Alfredo goes back home, carries on living his life. He gets a call a few months later, and he says, "You know what?" From the mayor of Skogul. He's like, "After you left, the people mobilized, they organized. The people in Skogul has never wanted for anything. They've never had a reason to organize and mobilize and advocate for anything." He was like, the people got together and they decided that they want a museum. And so they petitioned and advocated for it, and they're going to build a brick and mortar museum, and they want you to design it. And so for me, this is a really powerful example of cultivating desire. So he didn't give them the museum and say, "Ta-da, here it is for you." What he did was show them what it could be like, and then he took it away. And doing that was enough to motivate people to mobilize and organize themselves for something that they truly want. So I'm not saying if you want to build a hospital in your community, you must go and build a hospital and then burn it down. That is not what I'm saying. Will this work in every situation? No. But this was a really interesting example of how do we go about showing people what it could be like, what utopia could be like in your particular issue, in your particular struggle, enough to really motivate people to want to join, want to do something, want to care. And so for me, that was the reason why I put that in there, is because for me it's a really good example of cultivating desire in people. None of these will work for you. I'm putting it out there. You cannot go home and just copy-paste any of these tactics and they will work magically for you. They won't, because context matters. If you look at the Russian example, what's funny in one community is not necessarily funny in others. If you look at the Colombian example, the mayor knew that mocking his citizens would get them to move. Would that work in your context? Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But you need to find what's relevant in your context. With the pop-up food example, where do people gather? What do people do when they come together as communities in your environment? So it's really important that what these are just lessons that we can take and then apply to our own activism to kind of introduce some creativity. Why do we do this? They are more effective. And so quite often I do struggle with this. We're trying to convince people, especially like very serious directors and grown-ups, why we need to have fun, why we need to play, why we need to think creatively. Because a lot of the time what we're doing is not working. My example is our favorite intervention in South Africa is for any issue. The first port of call is we're going to march to Parliament and hand over a memorandum of demands. No matter what the issue is, we love to march to Parliament and hand over a memorandum of demands. This is just, it's what we do. But then if you ask someone, when was the last time that worked? When was the last time? Do you remember who even took your memorandum of demands? No, because that is what we do. We march to Parliament and hand over memorandums of demands, even if it doesn't work. So interventions really are more effective. They are more fun. And because we've chosen this life, we've signed up for majority of our life not to be fun. So I found when you use creative tactics, it really energizes not only yourself, but people around you. And communities want to get more involved. People want to get more involved and participate in your event or intervention or direct action. Cheaper and thrives in the contemporary landscape. I know there's some donors in the room. What is really nice about taking things from a creative point of view is that you use the ducks, for example, and the fishing competition. It took very little time, energy, and resources, but it did so much. So taking a step back, which is really hard to do because we're all into the routine of activism often, and we're all overworked and underpaid, and to be able to step back and say, okay, wait, let me apply some imagination, let me think out of the box, is hard to do. It creates openings. So it creates openings and manages to win people over that wouldn't necessarily have been part of your campaign. So the McDonald's video game creates openings for anyone who wants to play a video game to get connected and educated about what McDonald's is doing. So creativity gives that ability. It's more accessible because what it does, it uses culture as a basis of the intervention. It uses things that are familiar to us. We all know for media and communications that you can't have one message only that you say to everyone over and over again and to different people. It lands differently. If I'm going to work on a campaign for Gen Z versus people of my mother's generation, I'm going to do different things. And it's really important that creative activism really allows us the ability to create those openings. And it creates a culture of creativity, which I think is always useful. And not only a culture of creativity in, say, for example, a direct action, but it makes people problem solve differently. So in my previous organizations, we had a legal clinic, a health clinic, an advocacy department, a peer education program. And doing creative activism meant that everyone suddenly started thinking about problems differently. We had a 24-hour helpline, we had a legal aid helpline, and suddenly the lawyers were thinking about, okay, how else can we approach this problem? What is a creative way we can get our issue on the agenda? And I think the last thing I would like to leave you with is this very important thing, because now I've showed you all these examples, I've said creative activism, fantastic, and now you're sitting back going, I have no time, I have no energy, I'm on the verge of burnout 24/7. Now you're asking me I must do my current work and I now must be creative. You don't have to do everything yourself. What I said in the beginning of this presentation, that there are some people, there are people who are effective and there are people who are affective, and you bring that together and that's where the magic happens. So next time you have a meeting, next time you have a brainstorming, think about bringing other people into the space. Think about collaborating with different people. Think about working with people who creativity and moving people and affecting people is a part of what they do. And you'll find the ideas you come up with are far more richer and more imaginative and more creative. One of the examples I use also is with regards to comms, media and comms. When we're developing a piece of messaging, I often get my 8-year-old godson on the phone, and I say, can you explain your message to a Taru? And if he doesn't understand what you're trying to say, then he's not the problem, your message is the problem. And then I get my mother on the phone. And I said, Mom, these people are developing some advocacy messages, here's what they have to say. And a lot of the time, the people that are developing the messages are speaking in acronyms, are using complicated language, are not really making it accessible. But just by inviting my mother and my godson into a space, suddenly we're coming up with better ideas. So what I would leave you with is think about creativity, but more importantly, think about collaborating and who you're collaborating with and how you can do that more imaginatively. Think about how you run your meetings. I know from when we started doing our brainstormings outside, so team brainstormings, we used to have it in our boardroom, or we used to come up with ideas sitting at our desks in front of our laptops. Just small things like going outdoors and having a brainstorming changes the quality of the brainstorming and the ideas that you get. So there's 10 minutes left, so questions and things and stuff, yes. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there. That was some of the lessons in creative activism and why I think it's a useful tool in getting our work in human rights done. And yeah. Questions?
I'm coming.
Oh, I feel like a pop star with all this technology on me.
Teşekkür ederim sunum için.
Thank you for your presentation. It was a fun presentation. I am a graphic designer. I have hearing disability, by the way. So I make social media design for our association for the hearing disabled. On the 3rd of December, we celebrate the Day for the Disabled, the World Disability Day, and associations have celebrations, public organizations have celebrations, but disability is not something to celebrate. I mean, it's not a day to celebrate. It is a perspective. So that should be the perspective on the 3rd of December. We can't find translators in public organizations. You know, children can't have access to hearing aid because it's very expensive. So we did something. We said we're not present on the 3rd of December. We're not there. That was our heading. When you can't find a translator, when you can't buy the hearing devices, when you can't find jobs, when the problems continue, we're not celebrating the 3rd of December. So we created this post. We shared it. There was a lot of reaction. They said, why? Aren't you disabled? Why not, participate? So it took a lot of attention, our design. And citizens also paid attention, But we have disability, how can you do that? There was this perspective that they had. So we changed perspectives of people and we made the problems more visible. So they started imitating our slogan, the other associations. Other people started saying the same thing. We're not there on the 3rd of December. Others, started to say the same thing. So it was spread. So I think it's important to change the usual discourse. This could be a method or a strategy. There are cliche slogans, and when people get used to this, they get bored. They lose motivation. So it's important to get out of the box, I think, in that regard. And in NGOs, there is this state organization mentality. I walked around the booths. They looked very serious. Maybe they are worried that being fun will make us look less serious. Maybe that's the thing. I don't know. So I listened to your presentation and I thought about this. So I just wanted to share this. I don't know. Is this about our country, or do you observe this on other countries as well? Do they have this fun introduction at the booths, or how do they, interact? So I have this question, and maybe it will help others in terms of their promotions. Thank you.
really good example about making the invisible visible. And it's been done in different ways, using that lesson in different ways with different movements. I know in Europe there was one around unequal pay for women, and they were being paid, I think it was 25% less than their male counterparts, and so they calculated how much was that in hours, and at that time, everyone, all the women in multiple organizations all got up and left to say, we're being paid for this amount of work and no more, so we'll only work this amount of work. And so I think it's a wonderful way to make something that's invisible visible. The challenge to you would be is, next year, now that everyone's now using this, people are going to be desensitized, and now you're going to have to come up with something better, something more imaginative, something more creative. And so that's also the challenge about creative activism, is that the context is always changing, so our strategies must always change. I know in the sexual health and rights movement, we always used my body, my choice. And that was our slogan. And then suddenly it got co-opted by the right, and they were using my body, my choice. And then suddenly I was looking at an anti-vaxxer campaign in South Africa, and there were people with posters saying my body, my choice. And I was like, but wait, that's leftist slogans. You can't take that, but you can. And so you're going to find that maybe people that are your opposition are going to take on your very creative intervention by saying, we're not here, and copy your campaign. So it is about how do you keep evolving and adapting, because the landscape keeps changing. And with the examples of people being serious, that is all around the world. That is my, every organization I've ever worked in and with, we love a little pull-up banner that we travel around with, and we have our table, and we have our pamphlets, and that's how we engage in public participation. We did a very interesting thing a few years ago when I was working in sex worker rights, and instead of doing that, we created a bright orange stand, because that was our organizational colors, and it said, ask a sex worker. And we had an ask a sex worker booth, and we set up carnival. So music, sunglasses, and people came up to us and wanted to engage with us, because you see, if you see someone handing out pamphlets, I promise you, go look at the closest rubbish bin around the corner, and you'll find half the pamphlets that you've printed in that bin. And so one of the ideas we came up with was, how do we create a captive audience? So we offered free hand massages. This was before COVID. So we'd offer people a free hand massage, because we realized once you have their hands in your hands, they have to listen to everything you say. And it's very awkward for them to let go of your hand. So once you got them, oh, free hand massage, come, let me tell you about my organization and the human rights of sex workers and what we need to do and how we need to organize. And so it's about thinking like how creatively can you get your message through in a way that they don't feel like I've kind of intervened their space and like just forced pamphlets and information upon them. So they leave feeling good, we leave feeling good. And we did this strategy a couple of times, and then actually we were invited into Parliament during the budget speech. They invite NGOs to come and put up their stands and hand out the things. They invited us to come inside actual Parliament during the budget speech to give information. And so for me, that was also an amazing example of doing something fun, interactive, creative out in the public, and how that got to influence government proceedings within Parliament. Any other questions, comments, anything? Oh, hands. I love what's going on out there. I don't know what's happening there, but that's, oh, it's awesome.
So I will only ask a quick question then. Do you think that this, like, I consider myself as a very uncreative person. Do you think it's something you can like learn by practice? Are you doing workshops for this? Not only presenting, but for civil society organizations? Is there a infrastructure building in this direction?
Yes, it can be taught. So the Center for Artistic Activism does capacity building workshops. We're working currently with lots of organizations, Greenpeace, etc., on kind of building creative campaigning. But what I must say is really important in the sense that I'm working with Greenpeace now. Do I know the stuff that they do? No. It's not about me imparting knowledge. It's about finding out what they know and how to surface that and how to surface people's creativity. Because I know you're probably lying when you say you're uncreative. One of the first things I said is everyone has a creative outlet. And thinking about bringing that creativity to your activism is even thinking creatively about how gardening, the people who did cooking, they cook really well. They manage to make cooking part of their advocacy. People who do puppetry, people who love gaming, like there's so many different ways. If we just throw out this window that I'm not creative and think about what is my creative outlet and how can I actually bring that into my activism.
I just wanted to ask brilliant presentation, but if I actually take lessons from here and I go back, design a campaign, are there chances that it can still fail?
Absolutely.
Yeah. The reason why I'm asking is that we designed a campaign some 2.5, 3 years back, and probably we thought that we are very creative, but it didn't work. In fact, not only did it not work, but we started getting a lot of flack from the private sector. They went after us because they realized that behind this creativity, the messaging is that there is a lot of exploitation of tea laborers, and therefore the private sector went to the government and said that they are trying to destroy the tea industry. But our messaging was very simple. It was not very direct. So I'm just saying that can this ensure that our campaign would be really creative and successful?
Okay, I have 1 minute to answer before the thing cuts, and then I'm happy to stay and answer any questions for however long. Yes, all campaigns have a likelihood of failing. It's really about what we see as failure and how can we learn from that to iterate and make the next campaign better. Where I have found really useful in planning campaigns is not getting too precious and being experimental in low-stakes situation. So currently we're running an experiment, a series of experiments with an organization where we have 23 teams around the world running 5-week experiments to learn 1 or 2 things, and they get $5,000 and they must just play. And the idea is that it's low stakes. What we're really actually interested is in the learning, because in a 5-week experiment, as opposed to a 3-year campaign, we can learn really quickly what went wrong, what works in the messaging, what doesn't, how can we adapt it. And I think that's really important, because being creative about our campaigning means that we build in flexibility, adaptability, agileness, so that when we encounter opposition, we're able to react quickly and change our tack and change our strategy. So we're not always just bent on one way of doing things because we said we're going to do this for the next year. That's what we're going to do. But every campaign can fail, but also every campaign can win. Is that a minute? Am I done? Am I cut off? But I'm happy to take any and all questions. Thank you.